evening, and welcome to the Boston Public Library's Local and Family History Lecture Series. Tonight, we are very pleased to have Sue Mellen here to talk about her book, A History of Theater on Cape Cod. Sue Mellen began her writing career as an arts, entertainment, and features writer for the Cape Cod Times. Later, she worked in public relations, and after a short stint as a freelance business and technology writer, she began the content creation firm Your Writers. She has co-written and ghostwritten numerous books for a wide range of clients through this company, which she still operates. After an extended hiatus, Sue has returned to her first love, reviewing the theatrical productions of the historic theaters of Cape Cod and exploring the histories of theater groups that dot the Cape. Before we begin, please mute your electronic devices. Copies of the book can be purchased through our local independent bookseller, Trident Books, with free media mail shipping using the code BPLSHIP. Thanks for coming and enjoy the lecture.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I got started writing about theater. So I actually did a fair amount of acting in the 1970s and the 1980s. And I found that when I got on stage, it was an absolutely transformative experience. So I wanted to write about that because I am a writer. And so I started writing theater reviews and articles about theater and the theater culture. And eventually, I sort of moved away and then came back to Cape Cod. And when I came back to the Cape, I realized that the theater culture had grown and thrived in a way that I hadn't even expected. When I was doing theater in little community groups back in the 70s and 80s, it was a small industry, kind of a cottage industry. And now on the Cape, theater is a huge enterprise. 600,000 people view performances every year. And obviously a lot of that takes place in the summer, but increasingly it's in the fall. And even through the winter and then into the spring, that theater takes place. And that is so appropriate as I really learned as I dug a little bit deeper into Cape and to Cape Cod theater, because the Cape was the very beginning. It was the cradle of American drama. It was where Eugene O'Neill and the Provincetown Players actually began what became what we think of as American drama today. So that's why I wrote the book. This is the book, A History of Theater on Cape Cod. And I wanted to write this book and tell that story. So I'm going to read to you how I began this book. Okay, this is my first reading. So it's a summer's eve on Cape Cod, and up and down the peninsula, waves lap steadily against the shore. Gulls cry out and children laugh and chatter as they play a never-ending game of tag with the waves and one another. These are the age-old sounds of summer on Cape Cod. And okay, let's face it, there's also the sound of traffic engines and horns competing with the sounds of nature for airtime. But everywhere, up and down and across the Cape, are other sounds. There's other sounds waft through the air throughout the summer and increasingly into the fall season. These are the soaring sounds of an orchestra tuning up for an overture, laughter at flawlessly performed physical comedy, and dramatic lines that cut through the air like a knife blade, and everywhere, applause, applause, applause. And here's maybe the best part. There's no TV or movie screen involved. There are the sounds of the more than 36 theater companies now on the Cape. There are actually 36 companies on the Cape and the islands, and they continue to build the lively, vibrant culture of live theater on Cape Cod. So I want to go back a little and look at how that actually began, how it developed. So the early history of Cape Cod. And predictably enough, it began at Land's End in Provincetown. So in the late 19th and early 20th century, there were authors like Henry David Thoreau and Henry James, and artists like James Whistler in the US, and of course Picasso and Manet and Monet in Europe. And they were breaking new artistic ground. And in Provincetown, aspiring artists came to the Cape Cod School of Art to learn a technique called en plein air. And just as that sounds, what it was like was learning to paint realistically. So this was taught by someone named Charles Webster Hawthorne, who was one of the early Impressionists. And it wasn't long before the colony in Provincetown began to grow. And by the first and second decades of the 20th century, the P-Town colony, in fact, became so popular that in 1916, the Boston Globe printed the headline, "Biggest art colony in the world at Provincetown." So artists and writers who lived and worked in New York and in Boston would hop on a train. There was a train that took them to the Cape, and then they would wend their way down the Cape and make their way to Provincetown to create masterpieces amid the dunes. So revolutionaries were coming to Provincetown, not only in terms of their art, but in terms of their politics. So there were revolutionaries like Jack Reed and Louise Bryant, and then playwrights, including Susan Glaspell, who was one of the people that was very influential in Greenwich Village and in convincing some of the revolutionaries to actually make their way to Cape Cod. And along with her came Eugene O'Neill. And that's when it all changed. Eugene O'Neill was responsible, without exaggeration, for transforming American drama, for giving birth, really, to American drama as we know it today, with a little one-act play entitled Bound East for Cardiff, which was first staged in Provincetown, and then other works that followed. He led the way to a brand new way of looking at drama. He wanted to get away from European-style theater, European-style drama, to a truly American art form. And in fact, in Bound East for Cardiff, his main character, his lead character, is named Yank. And he deals with issues that Europeans weren't dealing with, like class issues at the time, which became part of the truly American art form as we know it today. Now, I wanted to read a little bit more about Eugene O'Neill, who was just a fascinating character. So the young playwright's somewhat inauspicious entrance on the Provincetown art scene was as a sailor on a boat that came in from Boston. He was, in fact, no stranger to life at sea, having recently worked his way northward from Buenos Aires on a steamer. And that first summer, he was often seen around shirtless, in shorts or swimsuits. It's been said that Henry David Thoreau, who back in 1849 walked the 30 miles of uninterrupted Atlantic coast along Cape Cod, and later wrote about the experience, wanted simply to look at the sea, while O'Neill wanted to be part of it. But if the sea was in his blood, so was theater. His father was a successful actor and theater entrepreneur, James O'Neill. So Eugene had spent a good part of his life around actors and playwrights. Soon after making his landfall in Provincetown, O'Neill sought out the group of bohemians that he knew were producing groundbreaking work in Provincetown. Susan Glaspell was one of the first to meet him, and she subsequently championed his work with the group. And thank God that she did. So in Provincetown, again, the revolutionaries were looking to absolutely smash the classical European mold and create something brand new, something that would appeal to the fishermen who were paying 50 cents a seat, as David Drake, who's the current artistic director of Provincetown Theater, said. They wanted to know what their own pens could do rather than simply performing and re-performing the old chestnuts, the old European plays. So this old fish house, which actually only lasted until about 1922 on Lewis Wharf in Provincetown, but it was a gift from journalist Mary Heaton Vorse, and it became the site for a couple of summers of the works that were destined to reshape American drama. And again, one of those was Bound East for Cardiff. As we said earlier, the playwrights were determined to create an entirely new category that focused on realism. But many theater historians actually go back to this single event of staging Eugene O'Neill's Bound East for Cardiff. And that happened on July 28th in 1916 in the Little Theater on Lewis Wharf as the beginning of theater as a uniquely American construct. So there are wonderful stories about what happened that first night, that July 28th in 1916. It's said that the actors didn't have much time, actually, to rehearse the play, Bound East. So O'Neill was there like a godlike presence, sitting in the wings and coaching the actors as they went on stage. And there were starry-high doors that, in fact, opened out onto the Atlantic Ocean. So as a part of the set, which was a tramp steamer that was stalled on the Atlantic, they were able to open these massive doors so that the ocean really became a part of the scenery. It became a godlike presence in the background. And historical accounts say that it was such a tremendous, such a new and a tremendous experience that the old building literally shook with applause. And it's also said that there was a terrible storm that night. So the building was shaking from applause. It was shaking from the storm. And it must have been just an absolutely incredible experience. So I wanted to quote again David Drake, who's the artistic director of the Provincetown Theater. And he says there is an invisible bloodline that runs from Cape Cod's theater's earliest beginnings in Provincetown through this spit of land and juts out into the sea. With the birth of American drama at the tip of Cape Cod, an energy developed and spread across the region. A lot of people who were in the theater community in Provincetown got involved in other theaters. For instance, the founder of the Cape Playhouse, Raymond Moore, was one of them, and we'll talk about him in a minute. And as you'll see, this replayed again and again up the Cape. So that was the summer of 1916. And then in the fall, that little group of revolutionaries actually decided that they wanted to go to New York. They wanted to see if they could find fame and fortune in Gotham. So they formally took the name the Provincetown Players, and they set out for New York for a season. And it actually turned out to be 7 seasons where they performed, first in what was named the Playwrights Theater, and then for 7 years in the Provincetown Playhouse in Greenwich Village, which obviously was named as a nod to their beginnings in Provincetown. And they produced plays by Glaspell and Edna St. Vincent Millay, which is probably a name that you know, and of course O'Neill. But the big moment came actually in the 1920 to the 21 season when O'Neill's The Emperor Jones was an instant and a really stunning success. And it featured a performance by Charles Gilpin, who was the first African-American professional actor ever to perform with a white company. And there was an innovative set design that centered on a dome that was fitted into the theater. But one thing that was happening at the same time is that the Provincetown Players were also going back to Cape Cod, to Provincetown, where they continued to act, especially in the summers. They would leave the sweltering New York streets and go back to Provincetown and perform. And unfortunately, the original Playhouse on the Wharf burned in 1917 and disappeared into the sea. So at that point, the activity moved to the west end of town. And I actually, a few months before I wrote this book, I had a tour of the old barnstormers, and it was really a barn. They actually did perform in a barn, if you can imagine a barn in the middle of Provincetown. But there it was on the west end of Provincetown, and somebody gave me a tour and showed me exactly where they performed and exactly what they did. And so Frank Shea was actually a bookseller in Greenwich Village, and then part of the time was in Provincetown. And again, the Provincetown Players were still gravitating back and forth because the Provincetown Theater Colony continued to grow, continued to attract actors and artists and performers and playwrights. And those of you who know Provincetown know that continues to today. So then, as I said, in 1917, the original theater, the original Wharf Theater burned, but there was another iteration of that, and that was born in 1923. And initially, the group that started this was headed up by an actress named Mary Bicknell. And when I first heard that name, I thought it was the old silent movie actress, but apparently it was somebody else who did live theater. And initially, they performed in a movie theater, and then they performed in the hayloft, down in the barn. But Bicknell and her group were traditionalists, so they disagreed with the avant-faire that was going on with the Provincetown Players works. So there's a great story, a little piece of theater trivia that says not only were they unhappy, but they walked away with props and theater benches just to prove how unhappy they really were about how things were going. So in the end, this theater, which was at 83 Commonwealth Street, the Myrick Atwood Wharf, actually also burned down. And you might say that happened mercifully, because at that point, the theater wasn't making money. Everybody was tired of trying to make it work and turn into something. So you might say that theater had a timely death at that moment. But that kind of takes us away from really early activity on Cape Cod. So I wanted to talk about what was going on in Nantucket. When you think of Nantucket, you think of it as being sort of remote and out there in the ocean and not too much going on. But really, way back in the 1880s and the 1890s, there was an actors' colony in Nantucket. And that was the Sconset Actors Company colony in Sconset. And it was thriving. there were people coming from old theater families who had long traditions of theater in their lives and in their families. And they actually built an actors colony that, believe it or not, had a bowling alley and tennis courts. And that was back in the 1880s and the 1890s. And the wonderful thing about this theater is that it has such a bloodline that there is still a theater on Nantucket, the Theater Workshop of Nantucket, that can trace its roots back to the original actors colony in Sconset, going way back to the turn of the 20th century. And in the end, they built a casino, because I guess acting wasn't enough. So they built a casino that actually gave them the room that they needed to perform really massive productions. And you can still see where the building was in Nantucket. It's this huge plot of land where the Sconset Casino took place. All right, and there was other activity going on still this early in Cape Cod. There was activity. If you take a short sail across the Sound, then in Falmouth, there was a group called the University Players of Cape Cod. And this was a troupe of actors from Harvard and Princeton and Radcliffe and other schools. And it was like a proving ground for some of the great actors of the time. Henry Fonda and Jimmy Stewart and Margaret Sullivan were three of the actors who were part of the University Players, along with Joshua Logan, who you may know that name. He actually became a really well-known and powerful Hollywood producer, produced plays both on Broadway and then movies for many years. And he wrote in his autobiography, My Up and Down, In and Out Life, about the summers that he spent in West Falmouth. And he said, each member burned with hot love, and not only to the theater, but for their company. Yes, and for each other. We actually believed we were better than anyone. Unfortunately, the group disbanded after just a few years, but not before producing some absolute spectaculars like All That Jazz. And when you look at this, it looks, I don't know if you know the name Busby Berkeley. It looks like a Busby Berkeley production. And these were college kids that had put this absolutely magnificent production together. And looking further in Provincetown, there was the Provincetown Playhouse. And this was a far cry from a renovated barn or a fishing house sitting on a wharf somewhere. This was an absolutely fabulous structure that was complete with a glassed-in restaurant and a nightclub and an oval European-style bar in the lobby. When you think of that in terms of a theater, it's just absolutely. And the other thing is there was actually an early version of air conditioning. And this was in the 1920s and the 1930s. And the manager of the Falmouth Playhouse was Richard Aldrich. And that's a name that's important on the Cape because he became actually the manager and owner of 3 theaters, the Cape Playhouse. And if you don't know any other theaters on the Cape, you probably know the Cape Playhouse. And he, for a time, managed that. And he wanted to fuel both the Cape Playhouse and the Melody Tent, which he originally owned, and with star power. So some of the early stars that were at the Falmouth Playhouse were Tallulah Bankhead and Helen Hayes and Gertrude Lawrence, who actually became Richard Aldrich's wife. And then people like Joan Blondell, Lillian Gish, Paulette Goddard, John Garfield, and Veronica Lake. And the interesting thing about, there's this little piece of theater trivia that the theater was christened when Tallulah Bankhead smashed a bottle of champagne against a theater prop. Well, after 4 years, Aldrich decided that he was stretched too thin, and he sold the theatrical jewel to a theater lover named Sidney Gordon, who carried on for 25 years. And then, unfortunately, a new owner burned this magnificent structure, which was on the banks of the Coonamessett Lake in Falmouth, which is a great loss to Cape Cod theater history. And then there's Dennis. So again, as I said, most people know the name of the Cape Playhouse. It's the oldest continually operating summer theater in America. And it was actually the brainchild of Raymond Moore, who was originally one of the Provincetown Players. And that's something that in Cape theater you see again and again. You see people go from one theater to another. You even see that today. It happens so often that an actor will find a part that they like in a Provincetown theater, and then the next week they'll be working on staging in Harwich or in Falmouth. There is something that's sort of integrated, which I think comes from this old and long-standing history of theater, so that actors and professionals and directors move from theater to theater. I see that today. But Moore, rather than staying in Provincetown, decided that what he wanted was a theater that was closer to the business district of the Cape. So that's the Mid-Cape area, the Hyannis, Yarmouth, the Dennis. And so he came looking in the Mid-Cape area, and he actually found a building, which was a meeting house, an old meeting house, the Nantucket Meeting House in Dennis, which first saw the light of day in 1790. And then he actually bought that building for $200 at the time, which seemed like a lot of money. But then he needed to find the right site, so he went looking for a parcel and found a 3-acre parcel on Dennis. And if you know the Cape, that's the 6A, the King's Highway, which runs on the bay side of the Cape. So he found that parcel, and the theater became another site for real star power. So in the first few years of the show, there were people like Basil Rathbone and Henry Fonda, and Bette Davis took the stage. And this is a wonderful bit of trivia about Bette Davis. This was where she actually got her start. She actually came to the Cape and was looking for a role, was looking to act, went to the Cape Playhouse, and they wouldn't give her a part, so she ushered for a week, and then eventually got a part in a show called Mr. Pym Stops By. Now, no one will ever remember the name of that play, but we'll always remember the name of Bette Davis. But Moore had more in mind than just creating a theater, a single theater. He actually wanted to create an art center. So, along with the Nantucket Meeting House, this is actually the meeting house as it stands today. It's the theater, the live theater, but he wanted something more. So he bought up a number of buildings around, and there was a building for staging and for props, and actually a junior theater, and then the Cape Cinema. And the Cape Cinema has this wonderful mural, ceiling mural, that was painted by Rockwell Kent. And the big thing about the Cape Cinema is that it was actually the site of The Wizard of Oz first showing. It was where MGM decided to try out The Wizard of Oz back in in 1930. And that seems particularly appropriate because Margaret Hamilton, who obviously played the Wicked Witch of the West, actually got her start, was in the Cape Cod Follies in the 1930s. Unfortunately, by the 1930s, Moore was failing. So he died in 1940, and there was somebody ready to take the reins. And that was Richard Aldrich, who we mentioned earlier when we were talking about theater in Falmouth. And he was noted for taking failing theaters and turning them around and making them magical successes. So this was really the beginning of what can only be called a golden age of theater on the Cape. There were stars everywhere, stars in all four of his theaters, the Cape Playhouse and the Falmouth Playhouse and the Melody Tent, which at that time was called the Cape Music Circus, and then the South Shore Music Circus. And then he had a great partner in all of this, and that was Gertrude Lawrence, who was the original Anna in The King of Siam, when, if you've ever seen shots of her dancing with Yul Brynner in the original filming of Anna and the King of Siam. So, but she became a big part not only of theater culture, but of the community in Cape Cod. People got to know her affectionately as Mrs. A. And there is, in fact, actually a theater in her name at the Dennis Union Church. And then right down the road on 6A, there's the Barnstable Comedy Club. And the thing about the Barnstable Comedy Club is that it's almost 100 years old. It actually got its start in the old Barnstable Village Hall, which was built in 1912. And then by 1922, there were theater lovers in Barnstable Village led by Joe Turpin, who wanted to start a theater group. And so they began what was, even then, back then, the Barnstable Comedy Club. And that sign, you'll see that sign is just from a few months ago. So they've been there for 100 years with their first production, Lady Windermere's Fan. And you can see, as I said, the Barnstable Comedy Club was printed on the tickets, which were a whopping 75 cents. Before I come to a close, I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes. And when we're talking about the greats in Cape Cod theater, we can't leave out Tennessee Williams. And obviously, A Streetcar Named Desire, The Glass Menagerie. When you think of some of his works, he was another playwright who, back in the, and I would say the 20s and, the 30s and the 40s, was absolutely transforming the face of American drama. And he actually finished one of his plays, The Glass Menagerie, in a rooming house on the west side of Provincetown. There's still a little plaque today where he finished The Glass Menagerie. And every September, there's a Tennessee Williams Festival that comes to town, that comes to Provincetown. And obviously their goal is to raise the awareness of the place that Tennessee Williams has in dramatic history. And people are literally bathed in the work of Williams for that week in September. There's a wonderful story about Marlon Brando actually hitchhiking from Boston to Provincetown to convince Tennessee Williams to cast him in A Streetcar Named Desire. So, a long bloodline that begins back at the end of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century of theater on Cape Cod. And as I was saying earlier, that this bloodline leads to an incredible future. 600,000 people on a normal summer see performances on the Cape. And while there was virtual programs going on during the pandemic, luckily this summer the theaters were back with outdoor stages and plan to be in full operation through the off season and then next season. So there is a continuing and ever-growing history of theater on Cape Cod. Thanks, everybody. So glad you came. Anybody have questions? Hi, yeah, sure. Oh, absolutely. And I do absolutely go into them in depth in my book. Yeah, they're a wonderful group. They started as Gilbert and Sullivan Players, and they're really what you might call the boot camp of theater on the Cape, because every summer they bring in the very best drama students from all over the country and do performances. They actually live there. They live on an estate. I don't know how much you know about it, but they live on an estate in Falmouth that was donated to them by the Cranes. And they perform and practice, rehearse at the estate. And then for 9 weeks every summer, always starting with a Gilbert and Sullivan. Their first production is always a Gilbert and Sullivan. I think I've seen Pirates of Penzance 3 times from them, but it's always wonderful. They are a wonderful group. Was there something else specifically you wanted to know about them? They were competing with the Falmouth Playhouse in the beginning. In fact, some of the same people that were at the Falmouth Playhouse were at the at the Gilbert and Sullivan Players. And you'll see in my book when I talk about their development over time that's what was happening. The Gilbert and Sullivan Players developed, and then the University Players were developing at the same time, and then that group eventually became the College Light Opera Company. And it's wonderful that they're still in operation every summer. They're in the Highfield Hall estate, which is where they perform. It's a great old theater.
The founders have kind of retired.
Well, it's not really corporate. There are 2 people. Mark Pearson is one of them, the artistic director, and then there's another producing director. I've forgotten his name offhand, but they manage it together. I wouldn't call it corporate. No. It's more structured, right. It is more structured. It was more informal at one time, right, especially when they were developing over time. Sure. And you said, and you wanted to ask a question?
I answered it myself.
Oh, okay. Sure.
But I don't know, would it be possible to go back a couple of screens so that you couldn't read through the whole one when you're talking about Marlon Brando?
Oh, okay. This. Yeah, I was just quoting a letter from Tennessee Williams to his to his agent in Provincetown about how he felt being on the Cape, that he was living in a shanty in the dunes. And in fact, those dune cottages where Tennessee Williams and some of the Provincetown Players lived and worked are still there.
Oh, so they actually live there?
Yeah, they still exist.
Well, I know they exist, I didn't know.
Yeah, they're still there. Yeah. And I love this quote from David Kaplan that says, "On the edge, artistically and geographically, Provincetown prides itself on embracing creativity and diversity and attracting legendary artists, writers, and filmmakers to its protected and pristine environment." Provincetown is really one of the big theater and show business centers of New England, I think. Really. Hi.
I was just surprised at how many Hollywood folks ended up doing stage plays out there. Like Tallulah Bankhead, that was kind of funny. And then also, the Betty Davis story is wild.
Isn't that something? Don't you love that? Yeah. She had to usher in order to get a part. Yeah, I know. I think that's just great. It's amazing. Yeah, lots of names. The Fondas. In fact, I have some shots in my book of Henry and Jane Fonda sort of leaning against a fence at the Cape Playhouse, talking about whatever production they were in at the time. It was a real bastion for top stars, especially during the 40s and 50s. It was a golden era. And it continues. That's what's so nice about it. I think a lot of people don't understand that we have this jewel right here in Massachusetts that has this wonderful live theater that's still alive. Well, thanks. Hi.
Hi. So I am not from the area. I just moved here from the West Coast, and I have to be honest that in my head, thinking of like the modern theater in Cape Cod, I primarily think of like college students doing summer stock and things like that.
Oh, no, not at all.
I would be so interested to hear what you as a historian of Cape Cod theater think are like some of the last 10-year like highlights of
Some of the last highlights?
very contemporary, because obviously I know the history of Cape Cod theater.
There's a group called the Cape Rep, the Cape Repertory Theater in Brewster, and they do some absolutely amazing original work. They do a lot of work by Cape Cod playwrights, and there was a series of plays by a playwright writing about life as a fisherman, being out on the ocean and what life is like dealing with the poverty, really, that comes with fishing. And I recently reviewed a play at the Rep that was called Rock the Bard. And what it was a version of Midsummer Night's Dream with a rock band and rap music as a part of it, and with audience participation. So there's some really cutting edge, unusual kinds of things that are happening. And Provincetown, again, is another place to go to see original works. The Provincetown Theater, I was quoting the artistic director, David Drake from the Provincetown Theater. They hold a playwright festival every year where new and budding playwrights come and perform their works. And so there is a lot new and a lot avant-garde that's going on.
Thank you. I was listening to you talk, and I was like, maybe I've let myself be in a little bit of a California theater bubble.
Right, I think so. Oh, yeah. If you find yourself on the Cape and you want something really unique and modern, go to the Rep, Cape Rep in Brewster. That's the place, and Provincetown. But at the same time, I also did a reviewed and then did a program at the Provincetown Theater's production of The Glass Menagerie recently. And it was just unbelievable. It was just so well done, so polished. So I think that that's a nice thing about theater on the Cape. There's this wide variety. Where in California do you see theater?
I was working in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Oh, so that must be wonderful. Yeah,
It was.
I'll bet. Hi.
I missed the first part of the presentation, but I was wondering if you could speak to, like, is it just because it was such a vacation area that all these people just sort of ended up flocking there and creating this concentration of, like, kind of artistic minds?
No, I think it was because it was separated, because the Cape, I mean, when you think about it, it's almost like an island, right? And so there's this sense of this being Land's End, a place to go to that's at the very end. And visual artists were attracted to the Cape because of the Cape Cod light, which is often likened to the Mediterranean light. So while Impressionists in Europe were going to the Mediterranean to paint in that unique kind of light, artists were coming to the Cape to paint in the light on the Cape. And then that began to attract artists of every stripe, playwrights and actors and poets, and everybody came along with the visual artist. And that's where those art colonies grew. And I think it was because they wanted their art to be something that was a thing apart. So they wanted to be in a place that was apart. Yeah.
When I think of the Cape, I always think of the Cape Cod baseball, summer baseball league. Like, I didn't realize there was that much, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think people don't. When I started realizing the history is just so amazing. Eugene O'Neill, Tennessee Williams, all of these fabulous playwrights. Norman Mailer was another one that produced a lot of his work on the Cape in Provincetown. So. All right, does anybody have any more questions? Thank you for coming, everyone. Appreciate it. It was great to be here.